Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I am very glad to see you on our podcast. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for liking the last video. Today we will talk about a man whom absolutely everyone knows. Even if you have never been to the USA, you have surely seen his face. Take an ordinary $1 bill. Look at the serious face with tightly closed lips. This is George Washington. He was the first president and the main founder of the United States. But what was he really like in everyday life? Was he always so strict and such a perfect hero? Today I will tell you his real and very lively story. We will learn about his fears, his big mistakes, and his honest victories. George was born on a winter morning in 1732. He was born in a place called Virginia. Now, Virginia is a very rich and modern American state. But in those distant times, there was no country called the USA. The land where George lived was only a small part of the British colonies. Huge territories around belonged to France and Spain. The world in America was divided between the great empires of Europe. Imagine this strange situation for a modern person. People lived here, built houses, planted gardens and farms, but at the same time, they obeyed orders from a man in faraway London. They considered themselves ordinary British people who simply lived across the ocean. It was in such a colonial world that little curious George grew up. His family was quite rich and respected in society. They owned huge pieces of land that were called plantations. But behind all this outward beauty there was a very dark side. The Washington family, like many other rich people, owned hundreds of slaves. These were people brought from Africa against their own will. Little George grew up constantly seeing people without freedom around him. This is the biggest and very sad paradox in his biography. Later, when he became an adult, he would write important words about equality, but at the same time he himself remained a slave owner until the end of his life. He suffered from this contradiction, but he never found a way out. In childhood, George did not go to a regular school with desks. He had no professional teachers, no grades, and no noisy classmates. The boy studied at home. He read old books of his father and older brother. More than anything in the world, George loved mathematics and neat drawings. He had very beautiful handwriting and a very clear mind. When he turned only 11 years old, his father suddenly died. This became a huge blow for the whole family and for George himself. He had to grow up very quickly and start helping his mother. At the age of 16, he made a very brave decision. George left his comfortable home and went into the deep wild forests. He began to work as a surveyor. A surveyor is a person who measures the boundaries of land. Imagine a young guy with heavy tools on his shoulders. For many months he slept under the open sky, right on the ground. He cooked simple food for himself over a night fire. This was extremely dangerous work on the very edge of wild nature. There he often met Indians and learned their ancient tricks. George learned to survive in the harshest and coldest conditions. These difficult years in the forests hardened his steel character. In the forest, you could not make mistakes, or you could die. When George turned 20, his military career began. But He did not plan to fight against the British king at all. On the contrary, at first he was a loyal officer in the British colonial army. A serious dispute started between Britain and France for American lands. Young and tall, Washington was sent on a dangerous scouting mission to the French. He had to travel hundreds of miles through snow and swamps. It was there, in the thick forests, that George heard the whistle of the first bullets. He wrote to his brother that this sound seemed charming to him, but the war quickly showed him its true and terrible face. One day his detachment fell into a very cruel and bloody ambush. Almost all his comrades were killed or badly wounded. 2 horses were killed under George, and his clothes were pierced by bullets. But he himself miraculously remained alive and did not even get a scratch. There, in the forests, he understood one very important thing. War is not beautiful parades, bright uniforms, and loud music. War is always dirt, cold, hunger, diseases, and death. Several years passed, and life in the colonies changed greatly. Relations between the Americans and the king in London became very bad. The British Empire had spent too much money on previous wars. To get the money back, the king introduced new huge taxes. Americans had to pay for everything, for sugar, newspapers, and tea. But at the same time, the people in America had no representatives in the British Parliament. They shouted, "No taxes without our participation in the laws." Massive protests began. Sometimes these protests turned into real fights. People went out into the streets and demanded justice and freedom of choice. At that time, George Washington lived quietly on his farm. He grew tobacco and wheat and did not want a big war, but he saw how unfairly they treated his native land. He understood that it was already impossible to agree peacefully with the king. George decided that it was time to put on his old military uniform again. In 1775, representatives from all 13 British colonies came to Philadelphia. More than 50 people gathered in the hall. These were the most respected people: lawyers, rich farmers, and merchants. George Washington was one of them. He was chosen as a delegate from his native colony of Virginia. He was not a random guest. He was an official participant in this important meeting. He did not make long, pompous, or very clever speeches. He just sat silently in the hall, but his appearance inspired trust. He was taller than everyone else, physically strong, and very calm. They chose him unanimously as the commander-in-chief of the new American army. But in reality, no real army existed yet. Washington faced a crowd of poor farmers, blacksmiths, and hunters. These people did not have the same uniforms, cannons, or gunpowder. Many soldiers did not even have shoes for winter. Washington began literally from zero to create discipline and military order. He spent his own personal money to buy food for the regiments. The soldiers saw that their general was suffering together with them. This is exactly how the legend of the great and wise father of the nation was born. Many people think that Washington easily and beautifully won all his battles. But the real historical truth looks much harsher and even scarier. In fact, George Washington lost many more battles than he won during the whole war. The professional British Army in those years was the most powerful force on the entire planet. The British had the best cannons, endless supplies of gunpowder, and perfect discipline. Washington was constantly forced to retreat and leave cities and important strategic positions. He was often criticized in Congress, and some officers even wanted to remove him from his post. But this tall and silent man had one unique talent. It was his incredible, almost superhuman endurance and iron persistence. He could keep the fighting spirit of his people even after the heaviest disasters. Once his army spent the winter in a place called Valley Forge. These were the most terrible months in the general's life. His soldiers were dying from cold, typhus, and ordinary hunger. They did not even have meat, and they ate flatbreads made of flour and water. Washington walked around the camp every day and encouraged the dying people. He did not hide in a warm house, but lived in a simple tent next to his soldiers. The most heroic and famous moment of that war was the crossing of the Delaware River. It happened on a very cold, icy, and completely dark Christmas night. His soldiers sailed in small boats among huge, sharp pieces of ice in complete silence. Many of them did not even have shoes, and they wrapped their feet in dirty rags. Bloody marks from their bare feet remained on the snow. It was a deadly risk, but Washington's plan worked perfectly. They attacked the enemy suddenly and won the first truly big victory. This battle returned people's faith that freedom was possible. After this victory, France entered the war. The French fleet helped to block the British from the sea, and this became the decisive factor. The War of Independence lasted a long and painful 8 years in total. In the end, despite all the hungry winters and losses, the Americans defeated the great empire. Washington instantly became the main national hero for the residents of all 13 states. People were so grateful to him that they sincerely wanted to make him king. They offered him absolute and eternal power over the new country and the title of monarch. For any other ambitious person, this would have been the most tempting moment in life. But Washington did something that surprised the whole world. He categorically refused the golden crown of a king. In 1783, he turned 51 years old. He felt very tired from the endless battles. George put down his weapons and officially handed power to Congress. He simply went home to his favorite farm. He wanted to do only agriculture and gardening. This act made him a legend all over the world. People saw a leader who had no thirst for power. However, the quiet life on the farm did not last long. The young country needed a wise and strong leader. In 1789, the very first elections were held in the USA. At that time, Washington was at his home. He did not travel around the cities and did not ask for votes. He did not run any election campaign. But all the leaders of the states understood. Only he could unite the nation. His name was included in the lists without his participation. George Washington won these elections with complete unanimity. The 57-year-old general was not at all happy about this news. He did not want to leave his comfortable home again. He did not want to take on huge responsibility, but he considered it his important duty to the country. He moved to New York, which was the capital at that time. There he began to create the first rules of the new country. He understood his action would become an important example. He refused pompous and expensive royal ceremonies. His wife Martha also did not like luxury at all. She missed her quiet farm very much. The life of such a great man very quickly became covered with beautiful and kind legends. The most famous of them is the myth about Little George and the blooming cherry tree. Probably every American schoolchild knows this instructive and sweet fairy tale. They say that Little George received a sharp and shiny axe as a gift from his father. He decided to test it immediately and accidentally cut down his father's favorite tree in the garden. When his father became very angry, the honest boy did not run away, hide, or make silly excuses. He looked his father straight in the eyes and said the famous phrase, "Father, I cannot tell a lie." This story for centuries teaches children to always tell the truth, no matter how bitter and dangerous it is. But I must disappoint you a little. This is a pure and very beautiful invention. This story never happened in the real childhood of George Washington. It was invented by the popular writer Mason Weems already after the death of the first president. The author simply wanted to make the image of the national hero ideal and almost holy for the young generation. People loved this legend so much that it became an eternal part of American national consciousness. There is another popular, but rather strange and even unpleasant myth. Many people still believe that Washington had wooden teeth. On all official portraits, he looks very serious and never smiles. George really had serious problems with his gums and teeth. By the time he became president, only one living tooth remained. This caused him constant physical pain, strong discomfort, and made it difficult to speak clearly in public. He was forced to wear special dentures, but they were never made of ordinary wood. His dentures were actually made of ivory and teeth of large animals. Unfortunately, sometimes real teeth of living people were used to create them. They were bought from poor people and slaves who urgently needed money. The dentures were held by tight and extremely uncomfortable metal springs. They constantly tried to jump out of the president's mouth during conversation. He had to clench his jaws tightly so that they would simply stay in place. It is because of this that on the $1 bill, he has such a strange and tense face. Look carefully at his hairstyle. We see lush white hair styled in neat and even curls. Most modern people are sure that George Washington always wore a wig. In the 18th century, expensive wigs were an obligatory fashion among all rich gentlemen and politicians. But here, too, we have another small but very interesting discovery. George Washington actually never wore wigs on his head. These were his own, absolutely real and rather thick hair. By nature, he was a reddish-haired man, but he strictly followed the secular fashion of his time. Every day he abundantly powdered his hair with special white powder. This was a long, inconvenient, and very dirty procedure for any person. The powder constantly fell on his shoulders and stained his expensive dark clothes. But the high status of the President of the USA obliged him to always look exactly like this. He wanted to seem to others a wise, solid, and very calm leader of the young nation. His appearance had to symbolize stability and order in the new state. George Washington honestly worked as president for 2 full terms. It was 8 years of very hard work, political intrigues, and constant disputes. People again and again asked him to stay for a third term because they were afraid of changes. Many citizens sincerely believed that without his authority, the country would simply fall apart. But Washington again showed his unique political wisdom and foresight. He said that supreme power should not belong to one person for too long. With this, he established an unwritten rule for all future presidents of America. He finally retired and with relief returned to his estate, Mount Vernon. There he spent his last years enthusiastically doing agriculture, winemaking, and gardening. He loved to ride horseback across his fields and check the work on the farm. He died in December 1790 from a very strong cold and throat infection. In his last will, he made one very important and brave step. He officially ordered to free all his numerous slaves after the death of his wife. This was his final and honest answer to that old paradox of freedom. George Washington was definitely not a perfect person or a saint from books, but it was he who created the strong foundation on which all modern America stands. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. I hope that the story of George Washington was useful and interesting for you. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you do not miss new episodes. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed this story. Share this video with friends who are also learning the English language. See you in the next episode. Until next time.